question for you tonight.
I'd like to ask.
My question for the at-issue panel.
Here's my question for you.
My question for the panel.
I have a question. And my question for the at-issue panel.
My question for the at-issue panel is...
Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton, and thank you for sending in all these great questions for the at-issue panel. We had good ones this year. With me tonight for our last panel of 2022, Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj, and Elamine Abdul Mahmoud. Good to see everybody. We did have a lot of questions, so let's get right to it. The first one is from Jillian.
If the Conservative Party leans ever more right and populist, and the Liberal Party ever more left, where will moderate voters find their home? And do you think that there is room for a movement like the Teal Independence of Australia to take root here in Canada? Thanks.
Not everyone's going to get to answer every question, but Andrew's going for this one. I'm throwing this one at Andrew. Andrew, off you go.
Well, it's true that both the Liberals and the Conservatives at this point seem to have lost touch with the center ground in Canadian politics. I don't think that necessarily will remain the case. It is still the case in Canadian politics, I think, that if you want to win elections, you've got to be somewhere in touch with where the median voter is. We see the Conservatives from time to time saying, no, we don't need to do that. We can just motivate the base. I think the jury is very much out on whether that is still the case. So I anticipate by the time the next election rolls around, the center ground will have reasserted itself in Canadian politics, at least to some extent. It's very hard for centrist parties to start up and get traction in a crowded political marketplace. And let's remember, even the Liberals, as strong as that brand is, not so long ago were in very bad shape. I mean, Justin Trudeau's leadership revived them, but they were in danger, and people were talking about them having to merge with the NDP. So starting up a new centrist party, I wouldn't be opposed to it, but I think it's unlikely.
Okay, Chantal wants in on that one, then I'm going to the next question. Chantal?
I'm thinking that quite a lot of voters are quite comfortable with the Liberal Party where it is and a progressive left-leaning kind of alternative. Every election that I've seen over the past decade shows that if you add up the NDP and the Liberal vote, you're well into a majority of votes. I'm not talking about majority government here. And the Bloc Québécois could not be described as a conservative party on any day of the week. So the fact is that the center is a bit larger than they're all on the left or they're all on the right. And in Canada, so far, governments do win by being close to the center. I don't find that the Liberals have strayed very far from it.
Okay, next question is from Caleb.
Given the recent Quebec election results, is the Big L Liberal brand dead in Canada, or is it dormant, waiting for its next revolutionary moment? Thank you for your answers.
Well, Chantal talked about this in an earlier panel, but I'll put this one to Althea. What do you think is happening to the Liberal brand beyond the federal government?
Well, I think it's hard for parties to differentiate themselves when there are two strong alternatives, and specifically when the NDP is very strong in a province. Yeah. Like when you think back to the Liberal Party federally, this is Justin Trudeau's party, and he has injected that party with where he wants the party to go, the values that he has, which are, this is a very different party than Jean Chrétien's party or Paul Martin's party. Yeah. And so you do have parties that can just take the shape of whatever leader at that time, but it is hard for a leader who is not a grandiose, well-known commodity to come in and to shape basically an empty shell when there is already an alternative that has governed in that province. And so that's what you're seeing a lot in different provinces. Now, I don't think I don't think the Liberal Party is dead in Quebec. I think the Liberal Party in Quebec had some big challenges because their core group of voters decided that they were very upset with them because they abandoned their core group of voters during the last legislature. I think this is a short period of time where they need to reassess, and I don't think we need to put RIP on our tombstone.
It is dire, though. I mean, we're down to one provincial government, the Liberal brand on it. They've had historically poor results in Ontario and Quebec. As I think Chantal mentioned, west of Ontario, they barely exist. But I'll remind people that it wasn't that many years ago when I think the Conservatives were down to one, or maybe it was even zero governments in the country, and look at them now. So these party brands have enduring strength, and you can't really write them off.
Chantal, Chantal?
But in the case of the Quebec Liberal Party, let's be clear here. The glue that held that party together was the fight against sovereignty and the fact that it was the only federalist alternative on the ballot. Now that the debate has shifted away from this debate, they are at a loss for a purpose. And frankly, the words empty shell, they apply to that party at this point.
Elamine?
There's always this desire to sort of extrapolate from the provincial onto this kind of a national kind of picture, and I just don't think this applies. I think this is the case of several different Liberal parties being punished in their specific context for something that they had done. So whether that I think that applies in Ontario for sure. That certainly applies in Quebec, and I think there's no particular reason I think to worry about the Liberal brand across the country. After all, the Prime Minister still a Liberal. Last time I checked.
Okay, we did get a couple of questions about one of your favorite topics for most of you, electoral reform. Here's Donna.
With this year's abysmal turnout at federal and provincial and/or municipal elections, many are calling for electoral reform across the country. Can we even think about electoral reform without instituting mandatory voting and a serious campaign for educating voters?
All right, that's a good one. It's got Andrew Coyne written all over it. There you go, Mr. Coyne.
Well, each of them, electoral reform and mandatory voting, I think would be advisable on their own. They don't have to be a package deal, both or none. I'll just talk about mandatory voting for a minute, which is, the data on this is very clear that countries that do have it have materially higher turnouts than countries that don't. And the specific example would be Australia, a country very like ours in many ways. They brought in mandatory voting, I think it was in 1924. Their turnout went from high 50s, which is more or less where we're at now, to the mid 90s, where it's remained ever since. It's not draconian. You don't get sent to jail. You get a modest fine. Most people turn out and vote. There's exceptions if you don't, if you're sick or if you're traveling, and you can always spoil your ballot, or you don't vote, none of the above. So all the kind of libertarian objections of, it's a sacred right not to vote, I don't think really apply. All you're required to do is get off your duff for 5 minutes every 4 years and go down to your local schoolhouse and mark your ballot one way or the other.
Chantal?
Well, sure, except that many of the people who don't vote actually are people who couldn't care less about getting informed about the issues. So you're basically saying, let's force people to go vote absent any interest on their part to figure out why or on what basis they should vote. That's one point. But the other point is, while electoral reform would certainly be interesting, and mandatory voting would be an interesting discussion to have, there is no one to lead it provincially or federally in this country. On both fronts, this is just not on anybody's agenda at this point. And voters are not, François Legault, who's the last to have broken a promise to do it, said people aren't fighting on buses over electoral reform. That is certainly true, but it does tell you how politicians view breaking such promises.
They'd be fighting if we were all on a bus. I tell you, that's when a fight would break out. Althea, last word to you on this.
So you could have a mandatory voting ballot with a none of the above option. So if you're a low information voter who doesn't want to pick a party, you could have that option. I agree that there is no one to lead the parade on either electoral reform or mandatory voting at the moment, but it doesn't mean that that may not happen. I think electoral voting, especially with the Liberals, they want a preferential ballot, and that is not going to happen anytime soon. But mandatory voting, I was having a conversation with a cabinet minister just last night, and I don't think this person wants me to say who they are, but at election time, parties spent all their time identifying their supporters and then getting their supporters out to the polls. And if you have mandatory voting, it shifts. You have to move towards persuasion. You have to try to convince as many people that your platform is the best platform. And that also means that parties are more likely to be nice to each other. And I think we can win. This is a much more positive way to reform the system, which doesn't require that much, that would have benefits for all of us.
Elamine, I'll let you just quickly weigh in before I take a break.
I mean, the problem with electoral reform, and we've seen this happen over and over again, is that it's a very strong issue to campaign on. In fact, people like it when you campaign on electoral reform, but then once you're elected, you have no motivation to carry that out. That seems to be the recurring cycle that we continue to be in, and that's because once you're a politician in your office, you'd say, well, why would I want to change the system that brought me into this place? That is, at its very core, that is actually a very cynical take on politics. That's genuinely a cynical take on politics, and until we work to change that political culture, I don't think we're going to get much electoral reform anytime soon.
Let's get right to your questions. Here's one from Nadia.
Do you think that the current deal that the Liberals and the NDP have will hold until next election?
Althea.
It can hold. Would it hold? Probably not, because the Liberals will go as soon as they feel that the moment is advantageous to them. So, yeah, I guess that's my answer. I don't think it's going to go all the way to 2025. I think even the NDP thinks that it's going to be 2024.
Elamine.
There's no good reason for it not to hold, but at the same time, the Liberals have been a bit sluggish about delivering the NDP priorities. I think if that sluggishness continues, the NDP have to ask themselves some hard questions, which is to say, can they continue to support that? Like, is that much of a record to run on? Because ultimately, that's what the NDP are getting out of this. They're saying, look, it's our governing record. If it wasn't for us, these things, you wouldn't have these things as voters. I think if you get to maybe the end, not even the end, let's just say like the middle of 2023, and you still don't have much of a record, like why would you still continue to be in this deal?
Perhaps because you would be looking at polls that show that if you're lucky, you're going to get back the seats that you brought into the House of Commons.
Right.
Or if you're really unlucky, someone will win a majority government and you'll become totally irrelevant, which is another possibility. Let's agree here that at this point the NDP is fourth in the House of Commons, and it will never have as much influence as it has now, even if that's not as much influence as it would like to have. So before you go into an election, you've got to figure out, will you still get Liberals who want to talk to you, or Conservatives who have no time for you, and will you be in a position to have more influence than you have now? Because whatever the record, at this point, the NDP is not on its way to become the next Canadian government.
Andrew.
It'll last until the next election, more or less by definition. It's just a question of when. But it's interesting that nobody's really speculating about whether the NDP will pull the plug. It's whether the Liberals will. And that's because the whole thing was only ever designed to spare the NDP from an election, not the Liberals. That was what was in it for the NDP in this regard.
Though I should say, Liberals I talk to, they sure do love it right now, that deal. Okay, here's Haley's question for you.
What do you think is the biggest national or international issue that Canada faces going into 2023?
Andrew, you want to take that one?
I think it's still the Ukraine war. The potential for catastrophe is so great in this. It's a fight that has to be fought, but the outcomes, whether Russia is defeated or whether it wins, are both perilous and are going to require great statecraft.
Althea?
I agree, and it involves us. And there will be more pressure. We're seeing it already with the government releasing plans to spend far more on defense. But yeah, whatever happens in Ukraine will impact Canada as well.
Chantal?
I have to agree, and there is no telling what a hard winter on the energy front will do to European unity behind Ukraine, and that could also have an impact on the situation going forward.
Elamine?
I think if we're sticking to the national part of that, it's inflation. It continues to be inflation. The fact that it's affecting us and also so many other countries without a particular end in sight at the moment, that has a lot of people worried. Right? And the idea that sort of projecting into the future and seeing whether there's going to be a mild recession or not, all that kind of uncertainty, I think, creates a cloud over the whole next year.
Okay, here's a question from a fellow named Andrew.
What will it take for federal politicians to start using the disallowance clause against the provinces?
Oh yeah, that one's for Althea, for sure. Althea, fire away.
New staff in the Prime Minister's office.
So never going to happen then, basically.
I don't know. I mean, it could if some key people who are vehemently opposed to this decide to either leave or listen to new voices, or new voices are brought in. At the moment, this is something that they do not believe that they still have a legitimacy to use. I know Andrew here has argued the opposite, and he has convinced me of the opposite. But that is the feeling that the Prime Minister has at the moment. So I don't know. We'll see. And maybe Danielle Smith might have something to do with it. Yep. If she brings in something that even Justin Trudeau feels he can't sit on his hands and allow to pass.
Andrew, go ahead.
It's unlikely to happen, and for the most part, it shouldn't happen. I mean, for the most part, these kinds of disputes should be settled through the courts. What was unique about the normalization of notwithstanding, this repeated use of the notwithstanding clause, it was taking the courts out of it. And that faces a much more profound dilemma, particularly when you're talking about the kinds of invasions of liberties and rights that are being contemplated by the provinces and are being done by the provinces. More broadly, I think the federal government has to keep it in its toolkit. It should not concede that this is somehow illegitimate, and more broadly has to stop validating the idea that the convention in Canadian politics is the federal government should never do anything that gets in the provinces' faces or annoys the provinces. And you keep hearing that on so many of these issues. Oh, you can't do X, you can't do Y, because that will make the provinces mad. If we allow that idea to take hold, then you're neutering the federal government as any kind of positive force in the federation.
Chantal?
So there's no magic bullet, and the disallowance power is no more a magic bullet than the notwithstanding clause. It would, given that it's not been used since the 40s, it would be a court battle that would resolve it, and the Supreme Court would have the last word as to whether it is still a power that can be used or whether it is a power that has fallen into disuse. The same is true of the use of the notwithstanding clause. But where Andrew and I agree is that on Danielle Smith's legislation, you don't need to go to the disallowance power. You can challenge the legislation itself, which is a different debate from the notwithstanding clause. But clarity on notwithstanding and disallowance could only come from the Supreme Court.
And preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause, I think we just need to make that clear.
Yes, exactly. Elamine, last word on this.
I mean, if you think that you have a federation in crisis, use the disallowance power and see what happens. We would get, certainly would be a much worse place. Look, I think with the reaction to the bill in Alberta, also with the reaction to the notwithstanding clause used in Ontario, we saw civil society kind of rise up in a way that I think is meaningful. And I think the federal Liberals are watching that. They're watching as they see institutions that you see in Alberta say, you know what, this would not be good for Alberta to introduce the Sovereignty Act. Similarly, in Ontario, you saw labor unions come together in ways that they've maybe not come together in decades to say this is also unacceptable for us. And you saw the internal pressure in provinces to see premiers sort of stand down on their hard-edged kind of positions. I think that's interesting. I think the fact that that exists allows the Liberals to say disallowance is not something that we're considering at the moment. I think if those forces didn't exist, then maybe we'd be having a different conversation.
Just quickly, Chantal.
The fact is that I have always believed the federal government could have shortened the time to get clarity on the notwithstanding clause by asking the Supreme Court to answer a few questions. It had that power. It missed that because it didn't want to get in a huge battle with the Quebec government. I think that was a missed opportunity because it would be interesting for every party to this discussion to get some clarity on, can you use it preventively? Is it your get out of jail card that you can just pull out of your purse when you feel that it's convenient to you? And that answer will come, but it's taking longer than it could have. Yeah.
The trouble is, just to Elamine's point, you know, it's one thing if you've got a bill that has powerful opponents like labor unions to fight it, or where it's unpopular with the majority in the province. But what about something like Bill 21, where it's a minority where the bill is popular with the majority, with the minority that's affected are not very popular? What do you do then?
Here's Davin's question. He's a Canadian who's living in the Netherlands.
Is Canadian society becoming more polarized? And if so, what can be done to reverse this trend? What role might media, politicians, government, educational organizations, faith communities, and other groups play to reverse this trend? Thank you.
Davin picks an easy question. No, he doesn't. It's a real tough one, and I think something everyone on this panel thinks about a lot. Elamine, you want to start us off on that one?
Sure. I'm thinking back to the first week of reporting that we got from the convoy. And the very seasoned political reporters were saying, we're out here and we are experiencing something that we've never really experienced before. People with a harder edge than we've seen at protests before. I think that's something that should be worrying everybody. I think how you speak to those people matters. And I think we haven't had politicians specifically try to speak to those people. I think you maybe have politicians try to get the support of those people without necessarily trying to address their specific gripes. I think we have to broaden, broaden the political language in this country to include what those conversations are about. I think that may be the beginning point, but also I don't even know where you start with that.
Chantal?
Well, I think spending 2 years not really talking to your neighbors or not having those conversations did result in what Elamine has called those people feeling that no one is hearing them and no one is engaging with them. And I think that also goes for politicians. There is something to be said about having conversations, exchanges, which we did not have over the course of the pandemic. But there is also always a risk to confuse debate with polarization. It's normal in a healthy democracy that people totally disagree about issues. And the opposite is kind of scary. So I don't think Canadians are becoming more polarized, but I think in this country it's always been important to keep channels open and keep talking to each other.
Andrew?
I don't know if polarization is the right word, if you're describing sort of an evenly and sharply divided society around an issue. We do, if you look at, for example, the Ottawa occupation, massive majorities of the public were against it and were in favor of bringing in the Emergencies Act to dispose of it. But you do have a significant minority, I guess I would say, within the country that has, like in other democratic countries, has sort of dropped out of the reality-based universe, that is getting their quote-unquote facts from quote-unquote doing their own research online. And the sort of socialization process where we have a common base of facts to work from is broken down for those people. And they are very intense in their feelings and very passionate about their beliefs. And as we've seen, a small minority that is that driven can cause a lot of havoc. That is an enduring problem for us. It's not nearly as bad as in our neighbors to the south. I think there are different factors at work here in our country. There's different sociological considerations at play, but it's large enough that we do need to address it.
Althea?
I agree with everything that Andrew said. To me, I do believe actually that Canadian society is becoming more polarized. I wish that we could all take a break from social media and talk to each other in the real world, because I think it would make a world of a difference. Andrew is right about the lack of facts in our political discourse. It's hard to get people to agree when they can't agree on the basic underlying assumptions. I am dismayed by political leaders who keep spreading misinformation, even disinformation. That's very concerning to me. I also am very concerned about the dehumanizing language that we see in our politics. We talked a little bit about this during Minister Freeland's kind of like verbal attack when she was in Alberta. But increasingly when you have, and you see this down south, I really don't want us to kind of adopt the bad habits that we see happening in the United States, but where people are speaking of their political opponents like traitors. This is dangerous language, and people should be reaching across the aisle to try to get more consensus. And it seems like instead of rewarding consensus, we're rewarding more divisive language.
Okay, thank you all so much, Chantal, Althea, Andrew, and Elamine. We should tell you that this is Elamine's last panel with us. Yeah. He is off to focus on his new radio show. It's called Commotion, if I'm not mistaken. It airs after Q on CBC Radio 1, so you will hear him every day there. We've enjoyed having you, Elamine. We'll miss you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the rest of you. Happy New Year. Happy 2023.